have an incredible panel to talk about the startup community in Latin America, entrepreneurship in general. They were just introduced. Right next to me on stage, though, is Angélica Fuentes. She's founder and president of Muvop. And as Eric Schatzker said at the beginning, we all are learning to adapt in this world, so sometimes we do things virtually. And so I'm so delighted to have with us, we have Pencz, who's co-founder and co-CEO of Loft. Mate, welcome. And also Sumita Pandit, she's Chief Operating Officer of dLocal. So I just want to set the stage in terms of what we have seen when it comes to the startup community in Latin America. This is a Bloomberg story that just ran. For a hot second, there was no better place for entrepreneurs seeking financing than Latin America. Startups based in Latin America raised $16.3 billion last year. That's more than the entire preceding decade, making it the region, the world's fastest growing for venture funding. But just as quickly as the money poured in, we saw it drying up. We also saw a record number of venture capital deals in 2020. Now, some are forecasting about a 70% drop in private investments in the Latin America region this year compared with last year. So the world changes fast, we know this. So we've got this great panel, so I want to get to it. And Sumita, I want to start with you and dLocal. You guys were the first unicorn to hail from Uruguay. You went public last year. You all thought about staying private. How glad are you that you didn't stay private and you went public last year versus the volatility that you might have faced this year?
Thanks, Carol. It's great to be here. And again, I apologize I could not make it in person, but it's great to be part of this panel, and thank you for having me. Carol, to your specific question, what I would say is that when we took this decision last year, obviously, we did not have a crystal ball and we did not know how much volatility is going to be there in the market. Having said that, we knew that going public went beyond a short-term objective for us. We knew that going public gave us quite a lot of advantages, including making sure that more investors as well as clients got to know about dLocal. So we are super glad we went public last year. We think despite the volatility in the public markets, we think going public allows companies to have access to capital on a more long-term basis. It provides credibility. It provides you a reputation, a branding, and all of those factors really go beyond the short-term objective of just raising capital. So we are absolutely thrilled that we went public last year and that we have access to public capital markets on a go-forward basis.
Angélica, I want to bring you into the conversation because you have dLocal who's public. You're on the other end of the spectrum. You're making microloans for women predominantly. They're small loans, but it's not just about the money. You're also providing education and mentorship and guidance. Tell me about the activity that you're doing and how much demand you're seeing.
Right, so I think that one of the things that women, especially women at the bottom of the economic ladder, are missing is training programs. It's, most of the microcredit loans are given to women and they stay basically flat in the same place where they started because what they think is that they need to just cover the expenses that they have, at hand. And one of the things that I've realized and that I saw years ago was that when you gave women financial literacy, when you give women the possibility of getting ahead personally, when they start believing in who they are, what they can do, then they make the sky become the limit. And so to me, it was very important to give them, access to finances, which they usually don't, by the way. In Latin America, 52% of women are not, banked at all, which is huge globally. And I think this is a number that I was shocked at.
They're not served.
They're not served, right. Globally, there's 1.7 billion adults who are not banked at all.
It's remarkable.
Out of those 1.7, 1.1 are women. 1.1 billion, are women, which is it's a staggering number. And so to me, what was important was not just giving them credit, but also providing financial literacy. And on top of that, giving them programs to train them to understand who they were so they can move ahead. What's happened is that the women don't just stay, in a very basic place, but they know, because they learn to believe in themselves, they are okay with taking risks. They learn that it's okay for them to be ambitious, which is something that in Latin America, if you're a woman, you do not even think that ambition is something for you. So To me, that's very important.
process to
It's a
bring-
process. It is a process, yes.
Mate, I want to bring you into this conversation. So I mentioned dLocal, public. You have Angélica, who's working on the microloans. You guys, still private. You've raised a lot of money over the last couple of years. You know, remind me about the ease that you've had in terms of access to credit.
Yeah, and thanks for having us all on here, Carol. Even though it's in a hybrid format, but it's great to be present, and it's you know, what we're looking at here is you know, as we zoom out, we're looking at a landscape where over the last decade or so there has been an exponential inflow in Latin America, capital-wise. And certainly over the last couple of years, there's been a very large spike. You mentioned it sort of for a hot second, there was a big influx. You could say that the party sort of started late here and ended together with the rest of the world. And I think when I you know, zoom out here, I've been operating as an entrepreneur for about a decade in Brazil. And I would say that over the last couple of years, access to credit, access to equity, access to capital markets more broadly has definitely been more democratized, but we're still extremely sort of early innings compared to anything else that I've seen elsewhere in the world. So when we look at sort of venture funding as a percentage of GDP, both in Brazil and across Latin America more broadly, we're talking about a small fraction of the penetration that you would see in markets like the US, markets like China, or even other emerging markets like India and Southeast Asia. So kind of when I look at not just our specific case, but when I look at the market more broadly, I think that you know, that there has been a sort of blip on the screen over the last few years in acceleration, but certainly I'd say that on a long arc, you know, there's still a long way to go to close the gap versus kind of more global averages of venture funding and just democratization of the credit and equity ecosystem for startups. Now, what does that mean in terms of the companies that operate, whether it's early stage companies or whether it's late stage companies or even private companies? I think it means that what you're actually finding today in the region are companies that by design or by definition are a lot more resilient. Whether they were born in the last couple of years or whether they were born a decade ago, companies just had to survive in an environment of scarcity, in an environment of kind of relative adversity too. When we started the company, when we started Loft in 2018, Brazil was you know, in a deep recession and was looking like it'd be coming out of that recession in 2019 or 2020. 2020, we saw COVID hit. So I think a lot of entrepreneurs, a lot of operators across the region, a lot of companies, when you look at sort of the financial health and you look at sort of their capitalization, you know, these are companies that structurally just had to deal with much more scarcity. I think that, again, lots of companies, us included, have been able to tap capital markets publicly or privately quite well in the recent past, but I don't think that sort of fundamentally changed the you know, hardwired DNA, if you will, of the entrepreneurs and operators in the region that just have to operate in a more frugal fashion. And I think you see that with companies like dLocal, you know, going public and doing so with you know, a much more robust business model than perhaps some of the markets that just are a lot more flush with capital. So I think the point I want to make is that on a relative basis, yes, we did see a significant influx, but this influx is, you know, is on a relative basis very little compared to what we saw in the US and elsewhere. And I think hence, as we look forward over the next couple of years, you know, there might be a sort of absolute decline versus these last few years, but we should, on a relative basis, see more interest in the region compared to other markets.
I have, sorry for interrupting. I would like to know, you know, you're talking about the capital markets and the money that's needed. There's a gap of around $93 billion between the financing that the companies of women get versus men. Women usually only get around $500,000 for their startups, where men get $12 million on their startups. Is there anything that can be considered, you know, for women to also be a part of getting, well, you know, more capital? Because I think that's...
Sumita, I want to bring you back into this because you were a banker at JP Morgan for about 18 and a half years, you know, and you were helping, you know, targets be found and connect investors with opportunities. I mean, what is it? Why is there still such disconnect when it comes to providing money for the underserved, and in particular for women?
I think there are multiple reasons for that. I think in most cases, what we saw, and I would say this is more when I was an agent and was trying to connect what I would call founders with capital sources. What we saw was that there was a big impact because of the networks that people lived in. A lot of the capital raises that happened in the earlier stages of a company's life journey typically happen from friends and family. Who you network with, what's your immediate circle makes a huge difference to where you end up taking your company. I do think that that's changing. I think there is more structured and purposeful investment criteria that investors are using today. And this brings into question an important point, which is close to my heart, which is about how purposeful should it be? Should investors have more specific guidelines as to where and how they invest? Or should it be really driven by just a profit motive? And I think that's the social question we need to understand as we think about investors. Most investors are driven by a profit motive. There is no other motive. But sometimes just a profit motive is not the best motive when it comes to where capital is actually flowing in the short term. And I think when there is abundant capital, it becomes easier to go after social causes. I think as capital tightens, it's going to actually become harder for some of the social causes to get funded. And that's going to be an important question. And I'm curious to hear Angelica's views on this. You're very close to this, Angelica. But I would think that if capital actually becomes more constrained, it's going to be harder to do good than to make money.
Is it becoming harder? Let me just remind everybody, if you have questions, please submit them to the Bloomberg New Economy app. We'd love to hear from you. So is it becoming tougher already as capital is
It is becoming tougher. The thing is that I believe, and to your point about are people going to, or investors going to do just, a for-profit company to invest in, I think that the younger generations are a lot more creative on finding solutions for social problems that we face today. So I think there's a lot more companies out there, startups out there that are for profit, for purpose. So in that respect, I think we're changing the mind frame about doing things. I've been working on women's issues for a little over 30 years of my life, and to me it's very important, this creativity that women have, and most of the ones that at least I personally know have those two concepts within their startups. They want to do good because it's something great for environment or for women themselves, or
well, they see a direct need, right? And
but but it's also a for-profit company, and I think that we're seeing those two linked together a lot more. But yes, definitely there is a restriction of capital going into companies.
One thing I wanted to ask the three of you is, what is it that you think the world needs to understand about Latin America as an incubator for innovation and ideas? And, Mate, come on back in. I mean, you could have, you yourself have lived around the world, right? And I just wonder, why is it that you chose to start your company up in Latin America, specifically in Brazil? What was it about Brazil that made you want to do it?
Yeah, I think it actually really connects with, point around diversity and gender equality and generally just the depth of the opportunity set that we see in Brazil and Latin America. I was really, really excited to solve hard and big problems. Now, it's not that, other places around the world don't offer hard problems or big opportunities, but I felt that, you could really, especially when it comes to bringing technology and innovative, new ways of doing things to bear, the Latin American ecosystem is just, really underfunded and short on innovation. So I think that's what attracted me initially. That's what kept me here for over a decade, and certainly, there is an increasing kind of ecosystem of foreign founders, of foreign founder-led companies. Also, a lot of cross-fertilization. One of the largest companies that went public here in Brazil last year, Nubank, is led by a non-Brazilian. So I think that over the last decade or so, there's been a recognition that there's a lot of opportunity in bringing technology to bear. And you're talking about less incremental improvements. You're really talking about fundamentally changing people's lives. And I think, just connecting a little bit to the point around opportunities for women and investment in female-led companies. I've invested in over 150 companies, both personally and also through Canary, which is a seed stage fund that I helped co-found and co-create here in Brazil. And one of the challenges that we have is, even if you put a pure profit motive aside, for now, we're missing a pipeline. We're missing a more fertile ecosystem of female-led companies. So there is still a chicken and egg problem, to which I think part of the solution are actually the companies or the later stage companies themselves. So one of the things that we're doing at Loft is, we have a stated goal of gender equality across the company, but not just for the company as a whole. I think it's relatively easy to say that you have 50% women, 50% men across the company, but women in leadership positions, which then becomes a feeder into women that are well educated, that are well trained, and have the ability and the financial wherewithal to step aside and say, I've worked here for a couple of years and I'd love to start my own company. And we're starting to see that. We're still talking about small numbers, but I think that this last cycle of innovation, which frankly was mostly led, at least at the top of the pyramid, by male founders, male CEOs, is now seeing a kind of second wave of female-led executive ranks, who, this is my hope, certainly will go out there and start companies on their own. We're certainly encouraging that proactively. We're investing behind that. It's very early days, but I think it's not just incumbent upon the investors. It's also incumbent upon the companies that are being successful in scaling to strengthen that as they promote gender equality across the board.
And if I may jump in here with some quick comments, Carol, I think that as a public company, I can talk about what we do at dLocal. So, if you look at our strategy, we have been very focused on emerging markets. We typically get the question, why don't you expand your business into the US or in Europe? And we have very purposefully chosen to stay focused in emerging markets because we think there is a huge opportunity. We think that we are really solving a hard problem, which is how do merchants accept payments from each and every consumer that lives in emerging markets. They may not have access to a credit card, but they may have an access to a wallet. Should they therefore not be able to use their wallet to buy a product or a service that a user in the developed market has always had access to? That's really the question that we are trying to get a solution to, and we remain focused on emerging markets as a result. We've also, just like Nate mentioned, we have very proactively gone out and hired women in senior roles. So for example, our head of account management, our head of compliance, our head of legal, our head of IR, they're all women. And I think that I won't say we are looking out and hiring women as the only option, but when we are looking out to hire people, we give men and women an equal chance. If you're good, you get the job. And I think that actually helps society. Because I think as more and more women come into these jobs, we are hoping that in 10 years, 15 years from now, dLocal becomes a platform from where multiple founders emerge.
Well, one thing I wanted to ask you, and I wish you had more time because when it's virtual, it's a little bit tougher. But the idea of looking at Latin America and the ideas that start here, whether or not they can be exportable to the rest of the world. And I do look at what dLocal's doing. You're working with Amazon, you're working with Microsoft. I mean, you're looking at connecting the emerging world and spreading out. But, Angélica, when you look at what you are doing, the work, can we apply this elsewhere? And should the rest of the world be looking at it and figuring it out? I mean, microloans are global.
Right. Well, it's not just on microloans. I think,
or the educational
the education. I think there's a lot of things, because there's a lot of creativity, there's a lot of innovation, and if innovation,
But what is in particular about the Latin American market that you think people are maybe missing, especially when it comes to the startup world?
I think Latin America can export a lot of things when it comes to technology. For example, one of the things that I was doing some research on what was it that people in Latin America were doing, especially, the younger generations. there's a lot of gaming, there's a lot of augmented reality, there's a lot of animation. So definitely there is a lot to be exported. This morning I was just talking to this man from Colombia who started a small outsourcing for call centers in Colombia, in a small place in Colombia, and now they're all over the world. So yes, there's definitely a lot of talent and innovation that can be exported, outsourcing services in different parts of the world.
Sumita, do you think in terms of the money that we saw, the incredible amount of money that came in last year, do you think we'll see it again?
I absolutely think so. I think for those of us who work long enough, we've seen these cycles come and go. I think if you go back to the 2008 to 10 crisis, the world felt like it was coming to an end. And yet that phase actually produced some of the best technology companies that came up today and the products that we use today. I think that, cycles are good. It helps you go through these ups and downs to actually strengthen your business model. And there will be some companies that will not survive the capital constraint that will probably come in the next few quarters. But I'm absolutely certain that the cycle will turn and we will again see abundant availability of capital as things improve.
Well, one of the questions that's coming from the audience and asked about the capital, whether or not the flows will come back, what sectors pose the biggest opportunity? I want to ask all of you, but let me start with you, Sumita. I mean, what sectors do you think in Latin America do present the biggest opportunity for investors?
I think that, and maybe I'm biased, but I do think that any product that makes financial services more available, just given how unbanked the population is, I think is a sector that's going to continue to see a lot of opportunity. I think we are literally just scratching the surface of that opportunity in Latin America. So I think broadly financial services. I would also highlight education as a very big opportunity in Latin America. And I think that is a place where social policies could make a huge difference to how the region evolves, create the technology talent that the region needs, and can we then export this talent to the rest of the world? So I do think that education as a sector should and will attract a lot of investment because one, it's the right thing to do. Second, I think social policies align when it comes to education. Third, there's money to be made. And that's like the perfect combination.
Mate, what about your thoughts in terms of the best opportunities here in Latin America? What sectors in particular?
Yeah, look, I think that we're in the very early innings of essentially sort of fundamentally disrupting large chunks of GDP here in Latin America. I think when we look at the stock exchange in Brazil, for example, we see that the average age of a company is close to 100 years. And that is because there's a lot of large sectors, be it real estate, be it healthcare, be it education, be it infrastructure, are just fundamentally today kind of hardwired in an analog fabric. And I think that technology brings a lot of efficiency, brings a lot of democratization to these sectors. So, we're obviously working to do that within real estate, but I'm seeing similar opportunities, especially in healthcare and in education as well. I think healthcare is one of those sectors that, I think we're really just scratching the surface in Latin America, and we're seeing tons of interesting startups that have benefited, frankly, from this boom over the last few years of capital influx. And I didn't see a lot of healthcare startups in kind of prior waves. So I think that a lot of the kind of Internet 2.0 or technology 2.0 companies that require more complex operations that have regulatory trappings, trappings and opportunities attached to it, those are the sectors that will get disrupted and I think pose a ton of opportunity because, again, I think there's a lot of underlying GDP there that, frankly, currently today in many of these markets is being owned by incumbents that are oftentimes slow to react and act in sort of oligopolistic fashion. And I think, again, fintech was probably the first inning, and now we're seeing that expand to other massive sectors of the underlying economies.
Mate, just because we're Bloomberg, in case you want to break some news, do you have any plans to go public anytime soon?
No comment.
Last question, just got about 30 seconds. What else could we do to help your community, which is when you're talking about a loan of a couple $1,000s or a small loan, what else could be done to help that?
Well, access to credit is definitely one of the most important ones. Education, it's basic. It's not just the good thing to do, but it's the smart thing to do for both men and women, especially in countries in Latin America. I think there's a huge space for people to be investing in. You were talking about investing in health, but also in wellness. I think there's one that, especially with the women that I work with, even though crypto is not the best lately, this last time, but it's something I think that people should think about, crypto economy. And there is $96 billion that get transferred into Latin American countries through remittances. No, ¿cómo se dice? Remittance? Remittance, yes. And, the traditional way of doing it, there are very high commissions, the rate of exchange, sometimes it's not the best, there's a cap. Once crypto gets a little, better stated there, I think that will be another big, huge opportunity for people to do in Latin America. But for women, it's definitely access to credit, training programs, mentoring, networking. There's just
it's a suite of
so
things.
Much to do. Yes.
Angélica, thank you so much. Mate and Sumita, we appreciate them as well.